First of all, I mean, the Americans and the British, they told us to write that letter. They told us to pay compensation. And then they opened their embassies and they restored the relation and they came to us. It was their game, not our game.
Hello and welcome to Afro-Muslim Perspectives channel, where we take on historical narratives and current affairs from an African and Muslim perspective. Today's topic is about how Ronald Reagan and a group of extremists initially invented terrorism out of nothing, and used one man, Colonel Qaddafi, as a test subject in the creation of the terrorism myth that would be used to justify endless wars, death and destruction by America. The extremist and radical group was called the neoconservatives, and they were known as neoconservatives because they did not believe or care in things that traditional conservatives had believed, such as religion, family values, and the defense of ancestral institutions. The neoconservatives believed none of that, only the death and destruction of the third world countries, especially Muslim and African countries. This group first gained influence in the Gerald Ford administration. Ford became president only because Richard Nixon had just been forced to resign following the Watergate scandal. But it was under Ronald Reagan that these radicals took over the entirety of the United States of America's foreign policy and military affairs. Now let's get started. In the 1980s, a radical and extremist group emerged from within the elite managerial class, known as the neoconservatives. They were war hawks, advocating for military conquests and imperial expansion through any means necessary. Their names have become familiar to everyone today, including prominent figures such as Paul Bremer, who became the ruler of occupied Iraq, Paul Wolfowitz, who served as Deputy Secretary of Defense and the President of the World Bank, and the Richard Pearl, who advised both Bush administrations and Ronald Reagan, Dick Cheney, who served as Vice President under George W. Bush and as former Secretary of Defense under Bush Sr., and Donald Rumsfeld, who held the position of Secretary of Defense in both Gerald Ford and George W. Bush administrations. This group of radicals would go on to play leading and cheerleading roles in what became known as the War on Terror. The neoconservatives aimed to create justifications for perpetual wars against elusive enemies that were never fully defined or explained to the public. These adversaries would always remain in the background, providing a moral basis for America's endless wars. So they came up with the vague and sometimes fake term terrorism and used Ronald Reagan as a means to turn this fantasy enemy into reality. To persuade the President Ronald Reagan, the neoconservatives set out to prove that the Soviet threat was far greater than anyone had previously shown, and was working with the Muslims to strike terror at the heart of the West. They would demonstrate that the majority of terrorism and revolutionary movements around the world were actually part of a secret network coordinated by Moscow to take over the world. The main proponent of this theory was a leading neoconservative who was the special advisor to the Secretary of State. His name was Michael Ledeen, and he had been influenced by a best-selling book called The Terror Network. It alleged that terrorism was not the fragmented phenomenon that it appeared to be. In reality, all terrorist groups, from the PLO to the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany, were a part of a coordinated strategy of terror run by the Soviet Union. But the CIA completely disagreed. They said this was just another neoconservative fantasy. However, the neoconservatives had a powerful ally. His name was William Casey, and he was the new head of the CIA. Casey was sympathetic to the neoconservative view, and when he read the Terror Network book, he was convinced. He called a meeting of the CIA's Soviet analysts at their headquarters and told them to produce a report for the president that proved this hidden network existed. But the analysts told him this would be impossible, because much of the information in the book came from black propaganda the CIA themselves had invented to smear the Soviet Union. They knew that the Terror Network didn't exist, because they themselves had made it up.
Covert action plan to be planted in European newspapers were picked up and put in this book. A lot of it was made up. Right. It was made up out of whole cloth.
You told him this?
We told him that point blank. And we even had the operations people to tell Bill Casey this. I thought maybe this might have an impact, but all of us were dismissed. Casey had made up his mind. He knew the Soviets were involved in terrorism. So there was nothing we could tell him to disabuse him. Lies became reality.
In the end, Casey found a university professor who described himself as a terror expert, and he produced a dossier that confirmed that the hidden terror network did in fact exist. Under such intense lobbying, Reagan agreed to give the neoconservatives what they wanted, and in 1983, he signed a secret document that fundamentally changed American foreign policy. The country would now fight covert wars to push back the hidden Soviet threat around the world. The neoconservatives now set out to transform the world via fake terrorism propaganda.
The specter of Marxist-Leninist-controlled governments with ideological and political loyalties to the Soviet Union poses a direct challenge to which we must respond. They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
In December 1985, terrorists attacked Rome and Vienna airports simultaneously, killing 19 people, including 5 Americans. There was growing pressure on President Reagan to retaliate.
It's time to rename your State Department the Capitulation Department. Get off of your stick, Mr. President. The American people are sick and tired of being kicked around. You talk tough. Let's see you use some of these billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons that you've asked us to approve. Your words are cheap talk.
President Reagan, as dictated by the neoconservatives, immediately announced that Colonel Qaddafi was definitely behind the attack.
Terrorists could not carry out their crimes without the sanctuary and support provided by regimes such as Colonel Qaddafi's in Libya. The Rome and Vienna murders are only the latest in a series of brutal terrorist acts committed with Qaddafi's backing.
But the European security services who investigated the attacks were convinced that Libya was not involved at all. The mastermind behind the attacks was in fact Syria. The terrorists had been directed by the Syrian intelligence agencies.
But the Americans say that the attack at Rome airport was organized by Gaddafi, not by Damascus.
No,
what do you say?
We don't have any evidence.
You have no evidence
supporting such affirmation. The only evidence we have shows a Syrian connection.
Do you say that it was Libya, and the president said that evidence of Libya's culpability was irrefutable?
Yeah.
But the Italian authorities to whom I've spoken say emphatically on the record that their investigations have shown that it was entirely masterminded by Syria.
I don't agree with that at all.
Well, they've interrogated the surviving terrorists.
I must just say I don't agree with that.
But you've no evidence that Libya was in on the planning either.
Our evidence on Libya is circumstantial but very strong.
However, in the process, a powerful new image was created that was going to capture the imagination of the West. Gaddafi became a global supervillain, at the head of what was called a rogue state, a madman who threatened the stability of the world. But Gaddafi emphatically and unequivocally denied the fake allegations, calling it racist. His view was that he was smeared and vilified by the racist empire of America as part of its long-term plan to keep people of color under its covert colonial clause.
This hostile position can be explained in racist and crusade terms. Suicidal attacks will have to be an answer to a military attack. But Libya is not affected by such measures that Reagan has declared. Stinking rotten crusader.
Gaddafi rightfully insisted he was no terrorist, but rather an international revolutionary who would help to liberate oppressed peoples around the world, including the blacks in America. Gaddafi arranged for a live satellite link to a mass meeting of the Nation of Islam in Chicago.
Brothers and sisters, it is with great honor and privilege that I present to you the leader of the Al-Fatah revolution from Libya, our brother Muammar al-Qaddafi.
Gaddafi told them that Libya was now their ally in their struggle against white America. Gaddafi promised that he would supply weapons to create a black army in America of 400,000 men. If white America refuses to accept blacks as U.S. citizens, he told them, it must therefore be destroyed. Then there was another terrorist attack at a discotheque in West Berlin. A bomb killed an American soldier and injured hundreds. The Americans released what they said were intercepts by the National Security Agency that proved that Colonel Qaddafi was behind the bombing, and a dossier that they said proved that he was also the mastermind behind a whole range of other attacks. President Reagan ordered the Pentagon to prepare to bomb Libya, but again, there were doubts. This time, within the American government itself. There were concerns that analysts were being pressured to make a case that didn't really exist, and to do it, they were taking Gaddafi's rhetoric about himself as a global revolution, and then representing them as fact. And in the process, the neoconservatives constructed a fake terrorist out of Qaddafi in a fictional world to justify the destruction and economical strangulation of Libya.
The analyst was certainly, I'm convinced, pressured into developing a prima facie case against the Libyan government. From the somewhat incoherent ravings of a maniac, both interceptions of a clandestine nature, interceptions of a open radio broadcast or whatever, as well as other sources, quotations of his, that one can assemble a neatly put together package demonstrating that the man had violent interests against the United States and its European allies.
In April 1986, Ronald Reagan attacked Libya. His targets included Colonel Qaddafi's own house. Luckily, Qaddafi survived the targeted assassination and later appeared in the ruins to describe what had happened.
The family were asleep, and my wife was, that day, tied down to the bed because she had a slip disc. I tried to rescue the children, and the house started to collapse, as you can see, and the books started to burn. They concentrated on the children's room so that they would kill all the children. Our small adopted daughter was killed, and 2 of our children were injured.
The Americans killed a large number of innocent children in that attack because their bombing was indiscriminate and vicious. Heartbroken by the devastation and death by Ronald Reagan and his radicals, Qaddafi called for the oppressed people of the world to take up his revolutionary theory, the Third Way, as a global alternative to neoconservatives and their racist and extremist ideologies.
I feel that I'm really responsible for conveying the Third World Theory and the Green Book to the rising generation, to the young American and British people, so that we can rescue America and Britain and these generations of young people from this theory, this electoral party theory, which enabled an imbecile like Reagan to rule the mightiest power on earth and use it to destroy other people's homes, and enable the harlot like Thatcher to rule a great nation like Britain.
Ever since he had been accused of the Lockerbie bombing and other terror-related bombings, Colonel Qaddafi had been a complete outcast. The West had attacked his country, imposed sanctions, and the economy was falling apart. But then suddenly, after the disastrous Iraq invasion backfired, the neoconservatives again made up another noble lie to justify their now falling apart invasion, to distract the public from the negative consequences their extremist actions and regime changes crusades were having both at home and abroad. What they desperately needed was something that would show the invasion was having a good effect on the Muslim world. So they made an extraordinary decision. They turned for help to Colonel Qaddafi, who they had always insisted was one of the world's most dangerous terrorists. And instead, they set out to make him their new best friend. It was going to be the highest achievement of neoconservatives' ideology of conquest and regime change via deception. A man who had been created by the West as a fake global terrorist supervillain was now going to be turned into a fake surrenderer through bribery, flattery, and threat of invasion. And everyone, not just politicians, would become involved. Public relations, academics, television presenters, spies, and even musicians were all going to help reinvent Colonel Qaddafi. It would show just how many people in the Western establishment had been infected by the neoconservatives and by now become the engineers of this fake world. Then Tony Blair, on behalf of the neoconservatives, broke live into the BBC Evening News.
The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, is about to make a statement the BBC understands from Downing Street. It's of international significance. He'll be making his statement at any moment. Now we can see pictures of him in Durham City. Here he is.
Colonel Qaddafi has confirmed that Libya has in the past sought to develop weapons of mass destruction capabilities Libya has now declared its intention to dismantle its weapons of mass destruction completely. This decision by Colonel Qaddafi is an historic one and a courageous one, and I applaud it.
Today in Tripoli, the leader of Libya, Colonel Muammar al-Qaddafi, publicly confirmed his commitment to disclose and dismantle all weapons of mass destruction programs in his country.
Colonel Qaddafi now became, for Western politicians, a heroic figure. His decision to give up his weapons of mass destruction seemed to prove that the invasion of Iraq could transform the Middle East. And Tony Blair traveled to meet Gaddafi in his desert tent, to welcome him back into what one journalist called the community of civilized nations. But as in the past, it was all a big lie. Gaddafi did not really have the terrifying weapons of mass destruction that the West claimed he promised to destroy. His nuclear program had stuttered to a halt long ago and never produced anything dangerous. He had managed to buy some equipment on the black market, but his technicians had been unable to assemble it. His biological weapons were non-existent. All he had was some old mustard gas and leaking barrels. But now he had to pretend to have a terrifying arsenal of weapons. And the West had to pretend that they had avoided another global threat. And then the made-up stories became even more complicated. As part of the deception deal, the West said that if Gaddafi admitted that Libya had done the Lockerbie bombing, then they would lift the sanctions. But many of those who had investigated Lockerbie were still convinced that Libya hadn't done it, that it really had been a Middle Eastern country. But Colonel Qaddafi confessed. His son Saif was interviewed about this confession.
You have to accept, or you had to accept at that time, the responsibility, because you have to accept responsibilities, you have to pay compensation in order to get rid of the sanction. It means we did that not because we are convinced that we did it, but because to find an exit out of this nightmare.
So what you're saying is that you accept responsibility, but you're not admitting that you did it?
Yes.
And this is all a sham, you're saying, just to get sanctions over with so that you can start normal diplomatic relations with the West?
Okay. What's wrong with that?
It's a very cynical way to behave as a country, isn't it? Many people would say.
First of all, I mean, the Americans and the British, they told us to write that letter. They told us to pay compensation. And then they opened their embassies and they restored the relation and they came to us. It was their game, not our game.
Public relations companies and the media were then dispatched by the neocons to Libya to do what they called reframing the narrative. One firm was paid $3 million to sell Gaddafi to the Western world as a modern world thinker and not a terrorist or a tyrant anymore.
Hello and welcome to Libya in the Global Age, a conversation with Muammar Gaddafi. But first, let's get the story so far of Libya.
After 40 years as the leader of Libya, Gaddafi was finally invited to address the United Nations. Gaddafi's speech was remarkable and spent most of it explaining his third universal theory and making demands for an investigation into the shootings of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King. When he was in New York, Gaddafi was offered a tent just like the one he had at home in the gardens of a grand mansion. The man who made the offer was Donald Trump.
You buried the lead. What'd you do? Excuse me. I rented him a piece of land. He paid me more for one night than the land was worth for the whole year or for 2 years. And then I didn't let him use the land. That's what we should be doing.
Was that over in New Jersey?
I don't want to use the word screw, but I screwed him. That's what we should be doing.
But when the Arab Spring began, the internet radicals were not the only ones who saw their dreams being fulfilled in the mayhem. Many of the political leaders of the West also enthusiastically supported the revolutions because it seemed to fit with their simple idea of regime change and destruction of the Third World. It might have failed in Iraq, but now the people everywhere were rising up to rid themselves of what the West referred to as tyrants, and democracy would flourish. So when an uprising began in Libya, the neoconservatives realized it was time to finally take out Gaddafi. Britain, France, and America supported the terrorist forces trying to overthrow the Libyan government. And Colonel Qaddafi suddenly stopped being a hero of the West. All the politicians and the public relations people and the academics who had all promoted him as a global thinker suddenly disappeared. And Gaddafi became yet again an evil dictator who had to be overthrown. His son Saif said, "The way these people are disowning me and my father is disgusting. Just a few months ago, we were being treated as honored friends. Now that rebels are threatening our country, these cowards are turning on us." Colonel Qaddafi retreated to the ruins of the house that the Americans had bombed 30 years before and addressed the world.
Those who love Muammar Qaddafi is the glory. If I had a position, if I were a president, I would have resigned. I would have thrown my resignation in your face. But I have no position, no post. I have nowhere to resign from. I have my gun. I have my rifle to fight for Libya. Withdraw your children from the streets. Take your children back. They are dragging your children. They're making your children drunk. And they're sending them to hell. Your children will die. What for?
In November 2011, a large convoy was spotted driving at high speed away from Colonel Qaddafi's hometown of Sirte. An American drone controlled from a shed outside Las Vegas was sent by Hillary Clinton to follow it. The operator fired a missile at the lead car of the convoy. Gaddafi then fled on foot, looking for shelter from the oncoming rebel forces. He hid under the road in a drainage pipe. The rebels caught him, mutilated his body while Western leaders watched on television cameras with smugness on their faces and champagne glasses in their hands. They might have defamed him as a terrorist, a heartless tyrant, and eventually executed him. But Gaddafi remains a hero in the hearts and minds of millions of people around the world. Rest in heaven, Colonel Qaddafi.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed reports.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.